Some of the greatest American chess masters are tragic figures. Both Bobby Fischer and Paul Morphy achieved remarkable dominance and then fled the game, suffering thereafter. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, the clear number one in American chess was Harry Nelson Pillsbury. He was a gifted natural player and a great tactician, but he was also a showman, giving incredible blindfold simultaneous exhibitions that, for example, inspired the future world champion Capablanca. And he also surreptitiously manned the automoton Ajeeb. After winning possibly the greatest tournament of the 1800s, Hastings 1895, Pillsbury sought a world championship match against the great Lasker. However, the match always eluded him, and he died in 1906 at the young age of 33. In his lifetime, Pillsbury scored 4 wins to 5 losses against the great Lasker. Here is one of his masterpieces and my number 9 best chess game from before 1900. Pillsbury opens the game here with e4, and Lasker is going to respond with the French defense. Maybe it's a bit maligned today, but it certainly leads to interesting and dynamic strategic play. Now we get d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight back to d7, f4, c5, and everything to this point has been super normal. Even today, this is really the main line, but now we get something a bit odd and not really best. Pawn takes c5. This is definitely inaccurate, maybe even as much as a clear mistake from Pillsbury, because when you capture here on c5, you're encouraging black to develop a piece and recapture right here. And you want to instead just defend the pawn on d4, leave it there, and hope that black will make the capture and help develop your piece. This is a classic opening battle of tempo, and here I don't really know why Pillsbury is choosing just not to engage in this battle of tempo and concede the kind of tempo battle to Lasker. Here we get knight c6, which is fine. You don't have to capture right away. a3, and now this is very odd from Lasker. The correct move is bishop takes c5, and black is actually much better here. The bishop is just incredible. Obviously, white really isn't trying to castle on the king side, but white does need to develop pieces over here, and this bishop is making it very hard to do so, and you have to worry about things like queen to b6. Instead, Lasker plays knight takes c5, which just is not nearly as good, partly because Pillsbury's last move, pawn to a3, clearly intended b4, which is now played, and then you're just pushing this knight back. So the knight didn't really get developed, and the bishop certainly didn't get developed, and I don't know what Lasker was going for, but he's losing ground here, and the advantage is back in Pillsbury's court. So now we get bishop to d3, pawn to a5, which is okay, but then after b5, this knight is having to fall back. Now, actually, the computer, after a fairly prolonged think, considers knight d4 the best move. I would really struggle to stick my knight into d4 right here because it feels like you might just not be able to get it out in any good way. But modern analysis from Stockfish says, it's okay. So you can put your knight on this really great central square, and that actually helps keep a balance. Instead, the knight goes back to b8. I would have kind of preferred e7 if I'm not going to d4, because on e7, while I blocked the bishop for a moment, I may go out to g6 or to f5, whereas here, sitting on b8, how am I getting out of here? This is a common problem in the French. I have had knights buried like this while playing the French, and I really try to avoid it. So, knight f3, knight c5, bishop e3, knight to d7, castles for white, pawn to g6 from Lasker, knight to e2, looking at this square again and being like, beautiful, beautiful square on d4, bishop to e7, queen to e1, a lot of things going on with this queen movement, possibly including eventually getting into these dark squares over here, which certainly can be vulnerable. Now we get knight to b6, knight to d4. This is kind of interesting. This is going to work out really, really well for Pillsbury because he's keeping this knight to go to a square that might be freed up later. Although, I don't know if he fully anticipated it. If so, that's very, very impressive. Certainly, it seems more natural to go with this knight to d4, and the computer does kind of prefer that. But this is going to pay off in spades, and maybe it's part of a master plan from Pillsbury. Here we get bishop to d7, queen to f2. knight over to a4, rook to b1, pawn to h5. And from this point on, I really think the game is going all Pillsbury's way. He's got his pieces fully developed, right? All of the minor pieces, the queen and the rooks, they're in position. They're kind of more centralized and threatening than black's pieces. But on the other hand, if white doesn't really do anything, one can see some strategic benefits to black's position, right? These knights are kind of hard to get around. Black's bishops, are kind of centralized. Maybe they're not doing anything, but they're kind of controlling squares. And, we're kind of restraining the natural pawn advances that white might like to make. I mean, this is the kind of game that Lasker won over and over and over again. But not today, not against Pillsbury. He's going to utilize his pieces and start ripping open lines from here forward, which is exactly the right thing to do when you feel like you have an edge in centralization, an edge in development, you're castled and your opponent's not. You need to open those lines. And b6 is a first move in that direction. And one thing this b6 move does is it frees up b5 for potentially a bishop or a knight, and of course it stops black from playing pawn to b6 and kind of taking away these kinds of open lines that might develop on the queen side. So knight takes d3 now, pawn takes d3, and then bishop takes a3. So obviously Pillsbury has played to sacrifice this pawn over here, and Lasker gets a bit greedy. I mean, I don't want to be critical because A, he's Lasker, and B, what is black really doing? It certainly feels like if I'm going to suffer, let me take this pawn and, maybe I have some counterplay here. But this bishop takes a3 allows Pillsbury to just go for it. This is a great moment to pause your video and try to figure out what Pillsbury plays because it's wonderful. Well, Pillsbury plays pawn to f5. This is, I think, one of the great clearance pawn sacrifices in chess history, going for it against a world champion, a dominant world champion. Super exciting. I said there's kind of a plan here to having this knight on d4 and leaving this knight on e2 where it looks kind of stymied. And it is this clearance sacrifice because now this knight gets access to f4, which is a beautiful square. So we've just sacrificed a pawn on a3. Pillsbury follows up with another pawn sacrifice right here, but lines are opening and things are getting very dangerous for Lasker. So first off here, which way do you capture? You need to capture this pawn because you can't allow Pillsbury to capture. It's just going to open all the lines. So you got to take on f5. If you play e takes f5, this is the worst version because after knight to f4, e6 is on the agenda. This pawn is hanging on d5. It's just too much right here. You can't hold this position together. So the better try is definitely, as played by Lasker, g takes on f5. And now we get knight to f4. And in this position, I think Lasker makes a bit of a mistake. It's hard to figure out what to do. And I wonder if he's worried about this pawn maybe becoming a target over here. At some point, maybe h4, g3, and then you just attack the pawn. And if you ever take it, then the knight's getting in here, and there's a passed h pawn, and all of these kinds of things. And maybe he's also worried about queen g3. These are very real problems. So he plays pawn to h4, which just doesn't feel super relevant because it's not developing a piece, but it does address those concerns over on the king side that I just outlined that are legitimate concerns. The computer prefers the move rook c8 here, which certainly feels more natural. You've got a rook over here that's not developed. Let me go to the c file and, incorporate that rook into play. Pillsbury has really great compensation here. Things remain very, very complicated. There's no knockout blow that I or Stockfish can see, but certainly Lasker is not going to have any immediate path to resolving his problems over here. So after knight to f4, we do get this h4 move, and the next move, in my opinion, might be the best move in the game from Pillsbury, and it is pretty much a winning move according to Stockfish. Rook to a1. Now, I know it might be like, why are we giving 2 exclamation points to a move here that doesn't sacrifice anything? But this move right here is really the game winner. And the sacrifices that are coming that are very, very pretty are all contained in the idea of taking this rook off of the b file, attacking on the a file where it seems like everything is defended, but intending some crushing sacrifices. So the sacrifices that are coming are contained in this move, rook a1. This sets it all up. So bishop back to e7, not really a better alternative. There's no good saving move for Lasker at this point. And now rook takes a4. Beautiful. Sacrificing the exchange so that you can then sacrifice a piece here on e6. Knight captures on e6. You can't really turn down the sacrifice. You're hitting the queen, and you've also got this idea of knight c7 check, and you've already wrecked the pawn structure, so you got to take. Pawn takes e6, knight takes e6. Again, we're hitting the queen, and we have this idea of knight c7, although we're not really, as white, trying to play knight c7 check and set up a fork to go after the rook. Instead, the main point is just to get these pawns that we're defending the king, and then to be able to take this pawn here on f5 and crash through with our attack, and this is unstoppable. So in this position, you have to ask, what if you try to run with the queen? So queen d7, queen takes f5. In this position, Pillsbury would be down a full rook, but obviously he's threatening an immediate checkmate, 2 immediate checkmates in this position, as well as, knight c7 check. Also, bishop g5 is likely crushing in many, many variations, and there's no way to defend. Let's say you try queen c6 so that you get an escape square over here. Bishop g5 is mentioned, super strong, the idea of doing this. You can't take the bishop because then queen here is mate. Queen here wouldn't be mate right away because there's an escape square, but if you move your bishop on e7, there's no escape square over here. That will be covered by a queen on f7. So now queen takes b6 check. You get a pawn with check. That's nice. King h1. And this is a decisive attack. Let's say you try to run with the king, king d7, knight c5 check, and the king runs c7, bishop takes on e7. And this is a position that's one of the likely variations that you can get. It is game over here. The computer gives like +7. White is attacking this bishop. White has a killer check right here with bishop to d6. This e-pawn is really strong. The black king has no safety. The black rooks are uncoordinated. It is decisive. A winning attack in this position. I mean, maybe Lasker should have gone for this. That's very reasonable to argue, but it is decisive for Pillsbury. Instead, Lasker actually tries bishop d7 and says, I don't think I can survive the attack. You're a really good attacker. Instead, let me give up my queen and try to resist in this position. And when you have a losing position, it's really hard to say how you should defend. Here, the computer actually thinks that bishop d7 is much better than trying to run because it sees the attack as being so decisive. Personally, I think you should make your opponent prove their attack. They have to find some good moves to win the game still. And here, after Pillsbury wins the queen, he does demonstrate great technique, as we're going to see, but it didn't really feel like there were any challenges left in the position. And even though the game goes on for a while, Pillsbury's technique is just, leaving no hope. After knight takes d8, rook takes d8, I really like this move, bishop c5. I think this is a real dagger in the position here because when your opponent has a bishop pair and you have one bishop, they're covering both color complexes. Trade off one bishop, and then, they can't defend the dark squares anymore. So suddenly all of these kinds of squares become weak, become so much easier to play for Pillsbury than for Lasker. So king takes on e7, queen to e3, looking at the dark squares that we just made vulnerable by this very, very nice bishop trade. Rook c6, queen g5 check, king f7. Here, I have to say in blitz, I'd probably be like, rook takes f5, and I'm going to win, right? And then I'd be like, oh, wait, there's really not a good follow-up. Instead, much better technique from Pillsbury is rook c1 here. Being patient, saying, hey, I'm up on material. My queen is dominant. Your king remains unsafe. Let me trade off one pair of rooks here, and that's going to emphasize my queen's dominance. So rook takes c1, queen takes c1, rook c8, queen to e1. We fork the pawns on the opposite sides of the board, which is really kind of fun. h3, pawn takes h3. I mean, we did damage the pawn structure, but the king is totally safe, and these are passed h pawns. Isolated passed pawns, but they are passed pawns. Rook g8 check, king f2, a4, queen over to b4, rook up. The king is improving. I love how the king is improving here. We trade off this pawn for this pawn, but that's a good trade too for Pillsbury in this position, because the A pawn was, not a legit concern, but it tied down your queen, and now your queen is able to start getting more active, as is your king, and now you can start pushing your passed H pawn, and there's really just no hope. Things just are falling apart in this position. The E pawn advances, which is very nice, and we finally get resignation in this position from Lasker after queen check. The position is plus 16. If you want, you can just take this pawn on b4 on the next move and proceed from there, or you can continue to improve the position because this pawn isn't really a threat. But Lasker sees there's nothing left, gives up the position. A tremendous win for Pillsbury. I think it's just one of the sadder things in chess history that we never got to see a Pillsbury versus Lasker World Championship match. That would have been absolutely tremendous. Lasker instead was playing matches against Marshall and against Yanovsky, and they were just blowouts. A match with Pillsbury would not have been a blowout, and maybe it would have been the case that we would have had an amazing American world champion in Pillsbury. Lasker's legacy is unquestioned, but Pillsbury's legacy should be greater than it is. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this game. I really loved going through it. If you want to check out more of my favorite chess games from before 1900, click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen.